You've no doubt heard that property doubles in value every 10 years. Is it true? Or is it actually bad advice?
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. And that's a good thing because between us, we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories and avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on.
We've got loads of free tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll get access to our free webinar, How to Buy Your First Home with the Right Amount of Debt. You'll also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to be educated home buyers. We have created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change rapidly. So always check with the relevant government authority or your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today, we're talking about another piece of bad advice, that the price of property doubles every 10 years. It sounds compelling, and there are even statistics that show it could be true, but like everything, the devil is in the detail. And before we get to that, what's your special house in the video behind you this week? Megan, I can't even see it.
Can you see it? Can you see it?
What
it's
is it?
The Invisible House. So this, of course, is in California. Where else do you build an invisible house? But it is really made of reflective glass, and it is it's almost like a cargo container that has been made of mirrors. It's got an indoor swimming pool, and this is, of course, through the OMG category of Airbnb. Maybe we should talk to them about sponsorship, Veronica.
I reckon we should.
I am flogging that every week.
I know. We've missed a trick there. It's interesting because from where I sit looking at the video, I couldn't tell it's mirrors. It just looked like a giant mural that looks like the surrounding landscape. But mirrors, all I can think of is that must be a fire risk.
Well, I don't know that you'd have any fires around it. It's arid. It's desert.
There's no foliage. Anyway, right.
But I hear what you say. You know, if the sun reflects off it and it magnifies and it sets fire, you know, kids love doing that with a magnifying glass, don't they? Setting fire to an ant or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Totally. Terrible. It's so awful, isn't it?
Well, let's get on to it. Your house is not going to be made of mirrors or hopefully not glass. Could be, but probably not.
No. In fact, yes, the whole other episode on climate change and how to avoid having your house heat up. But anyway, we have seen charts, right, back to property data and whether prices double every 10 years or not.
And remember, this is part of our bad advice series.
Yes,
we're talking
advice.
about bad advice that people give you thinking they're giving you good advice.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we've seen charts going back as far as 100 years that shows that property values in this country have gone up an average around about 8% per annum, which means that if you took that as gospel, every property in Australia would more than double every 10 years because it takes an average growth rate of 7.2% per annum to achieve that.
Can we just remind everybody that's the magic of compound growth?
It is.
It's not 100 years divided by, 10%. Do you know what I mean? Like it's compound, and that is the beauty of property. So there is a real positive in there. But the bad advice, Veronica.
The bad advice. This is what's called aggregated data. And that is where every single property in this country is included in the data set. And likewise, if you see Sydney property markets doing X, Brisbane's doing Y, Perth's doing X, it's an aggregated figure that's based on our entire market, right? So there's a problem that we're going to tease it out here, but that is a problem.
It is, because how many times have we talked about there is no single market?
Exactly. And also when you look at a lot of data over a long period of time, the growth curve sort of smooths out a bit. And whereas it's actually in reality quite lumpy. Some years there's growth spurts and other years it's flat and others it will be the prices will fall, right? And then there's the fact that not all markets grow in value or fall in value at the same time nor at the same rate.
So while it might be true, according to these charts that the value of the entire property market roughly doubles every 10 years, you're not buying a slice of the whole market. You're actually buying one property, one single property. So it's good to understand that growth can vary depending on location and property type.
Absolutely. Now, also, very recently, I read this report actually put out by CoreLogic, and they even say they're sort of, spoiler alert, blowing the 10-year myth. But anyway, we'll put the link in the show notes, right? But also, it basically goes over the last 30 years, and it actually shows in very interesting ways how these variables play out over those 3 decades.
It's interesting, isn't it? Now, we know you're not going to own your first home for 30 years. It's highly unlikely. Some people do, and your parents may well have owned their home for even longer than that. But hear us out, and we'll explain why it matters to you shortly.
Now, I'm going to quote from the report, right? It says, dispelling a long-held housing myth, it's actually rare for housing values to double in 10 years. Over the past decade, none of the capitals and only one regional market, that's regional Tasmania, recorded a growth rate of 100% or higher. So it has to be 100% in order to double, right? In the previous decade, so that's 2002 to 2012, it was only Perth and Darwin where housing values doubled. And we will talk a bit more about that coming up.
It's interesting. And yet I can show you individual properties in my area, and I know you have got individual properties in your area, Veronica, that have doubled in 6, 7, 8 years in the early noughties. So, Brisbane had that massive price spike, 2002, 2003. And into the teens, we had, Sydney had that huge amount of growth.
Yeah.
Some of those properties that you were looking at, good quality properties, went up more than that.
In order to double in 6 years, your average annual growth is 12%. So that's huge. And over, we had a boom in Sydney 2012, 2017. And in that period of time, I saw plenty of properties that actually even doubled in 5 years. So that's why, and data people will argue, okay, well, that's going to revert to the mean and that's going to slow down and those properties won't actually increase in value over a period of time and they'll actually fall and blah, blah, blah. The reality is that in an individual market, there are some properties that outperform and those that underperform. But when you chuck all the data in together, those overperforming property data gets mixed in with the underperforming property data and all the ordinary performing properties, that all gets chucked in together and it comes up with data that might infer that everything goes up.
Yeah.
Or everything falls or everything doubles or everything doesn't or whatever. And so I think that's what's this really does show is that when we look at big data, we're missing out on the nuance. And that is very much about what we talk about all the time here is that what you buy really matters wherever you're buying and whenever you're buying.
Yeah. It's interesting, you and I, in our buyer's agency businesses, I know that we have people from interstate ring and say, look, I'm looking at buying a property in Brisbane because I think there's going to be some great growth there over the next 5 years. And we really have to pull people back and say, it doesn't matter what you think is going to happen in Brisbane. It is the property that you're going to buy, the right one that's going to actually outperform the market. And in fact, pushing back a little bit more, is there another area in Australia that might perform better than the best performing suburb or property in Brisbane or Sydney or, so actually having that big picture look is important, but then narrowing down to the individual property that's going to deliver the best results in the best location is hard, but that's what we do, right?
It's really hard and it's exactly what we do. And because people really like to look at data as making them feel safer about their decisions, because of course property is a very, it's risky, it's expensive. You know how long it's taking you to save your deposit, and then you think, God, I don't want to blow it. You're borrowing enough money that's going to, that your first mortgage, you're taking out a 30-year mortgage, and we almost can guarantee you will not be having that same mortgage in 30 years. You will not be paying that mortgage off in 30 years. Things will change, right? You'll refinance, you'll upgrade, you'll change properties, you'll whatever. There'll be lots of different things. I very much doubt you'll have the same mortgage in 30 years' time. But this is why it's bad advice, because anything that basically looks at total market data, and it's interesting just to know what's going on in a sort of macro sense, but anything that looks at total market data and says you should make a decision because of this big picture data, that's where it's bad advice, because the actual fact is you're making one decision about one property, not a decision on a market. And so that's where the danger comes in. It's why it becomes bad advice.
Yep. I'm going to pull out another quote from the report that you mentioned, and that is that capital cities have recorded a higher growth rate than the regional areas of Australia over the past 30 years, with dwelling values rising by 409 and 294% respectively across each of the combined capital city and rest of the state regions.
So if we just do a little slight rounding on that, that's basically saying that cities have, on average, and once again, that's saying that Perth's done the same. That's saying Perth and Brisbane have done the same thing, right? Have basically got up 4 times, and the regions have only gone up 3 times. That's sort of basically summarising that.
30 years.
Over 30 years, yes.
Piling all in together. The high growth rate across our capital cities probably reflects a combination of higher demand and greater scarcity of supply compared to the regional markets, along with more diversified economic conditions within the capital cities. Veronica, I don't like that as a stat. That makes me so uncomfortable.
And there's really good reason why it makes you uncomfortable, because if you take this at face value, it might mean that you avoid some regional areas because they're not capital cities, right? But we have regional cities that are bigger than Hobart. Right. So it talks about, well, the reason the capital cities perform better is because they've got bigger populations or whatever. It's like, well, actually Newcastle, Geelong, Toowoomba, there's probably others. They're all bigger than Hobart, right?
But they're not in the capital city data.
No, exactly. Yeah. Their data is not lumped in with capital cities data. It's lumped in with the rest of data. And let me tell you what the rest of is, right? So this is something I learned through Kent Lardner. We do those data reports with him on the Elephant in the Room. And I said, so what is this rest of? And it might actually have been Eliza Owen from CoreLogic, but it was somebody that I really respect in data. I said, what's this rest of thing? So when they look at Queensland, for example, now it's an entire huge state. So is WA. They're all big, but like WA, you've got Perth, and then you've got the rest of Western Australia.
So you're going all the way from Broome down to, the
Margaret River or Albany or whatever's down there.
Margaret River, all in one data set.
Yeah. You've got, Queensland, you think you've got mining, you've got tourism, you've got agriculture, you've got the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is rest of Queensland. So you've got Brisbane, and then you've got rest of Queensland. So
and they are so individual. They are driven by such different factors. They've got different economic bases. They've got different population movements. They've got different lifestyle components. Just, you can't lump this stuff in together.
No. And yet it is for various reasons, and there's reasons to lump the data together. But the reality is that if you're making an individual property decision, you don't want to avoid the regions, because this report says, well, actually they only went up 3 times over 30 years, whereas capital cities went up 4 times. And you go, right, well, I'm going to go and buy in, Hobart, because I'm not going to go and buy in a region for that reason. You know what I mean? So that it's just that if you don't interrogate the data and understand and pull it apart, understand what's in it, what it really means, then you can make assumptions that are incorrect.
Now, don't get us wrong. We're not saying the data is incorrect. In fact, we use a lot of CoreLogic data. So we're not making a judgment about the data. What we're saying to you as an individual is, if your reliance is on the data, then your thinking may be flawed. So the bad advice is not so much that the data is wrong or the people that are providing the data is wrong. It's what you do with it and what decisions you make around it.
So basically what we're saying here is that the doubling every 10 years, technically on paper you can say is correct, although the CoreLogic report says over the last 30 years is not correct. But the reality is when you start pulling that apart, it's different areas will perform differently, different times. Like there were Perth and Darwin were the darlings of the noughties, but in the teens, they were horrific, right? So, they might double.
It was tough to be a seller in those markets and great to be a buyer.
Very terrible. And so it's like, okay, this is bad advice, because if you act on it and think that it's all going to be okay because it's all right because everything doubles every 10 years, you could get caught out because it's not that simple. I quote another quote from this report. It says, most regions have seen house values rise substantially more than unit values after the past 30 years.
And look, that, certainly when you look at the basics of what people talk about, experts, and I'm going to use my fingers in inverted commas here, experts talk about the land appreciates, the thing that's sitting on it depreciates. It kind of makes sense. But, it's another reason that we really urge people to be very, very careful about buying a unit. But again, it's market dependent, Veronica. There are suburbs in your inner Sydney area, for example, where a great unit will do so much better than a hill.
That's exactly right. Or perhaps in Brisbane, like a 3-bedroom unit, Megan. From my understanding is that there's not enough of them and there's actually a good demand for them.
There is a great demand from downsizers for well-located lifestyle precinct downsizing units. So 3 bedrooms, good size, nice big grand living rooms, good views and outlooks, double car parks. There are not enough of those, and those prices are being forced up because of the scarcity. But when you compare that to something that is oversupplied, which is a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit with 1 car park, you can buy those, just snap your fingers and you'll pick one up, and probably cheaper than the last person that bought it. That's the descending value of some of those oversupplied types of properties. I'd love to see developers doing a lot more of these downsizing units, but they don't tend to get as much profit out of them. I think the demand will probably push them in that direction. But, it's a good example of the scarcity that we talk about. One of our principles is if it's easy to buy, it's going to be hard to sell. And that's the scarcity factor. Who wants it at the end?
And so when you look at unit data, it lumps in those well-performing properties with all the stuff that did okay and all the stuff that lost money altogether. And so it's difficult to price and tease that apart. And a lot of people say, I would never buy a unit because they lose money or they don't make as much money as houses.
Look at the median house price.
Yeah, some individual properties individual apartments can actually do better than a compromised house. So if you're going to buy a little house on a main road or a really cracker 3-bedroom unit in the same suburb, you might be better off buying the cracker 3-bedroom unit. So this is just the thinking we want to get you thinking about, applying this thinking and this logic to understand that a really good property can defy what the data says.
Yes, and a really bad property can defy the data as well. In a really good, strong market, a really bad property can really underperform significantly.
In fact, so another report that CoreLogic puts out every quarter, which is, I think, one of my favorite property reports, it's called the Pain and Gain Report. Now, you've probably heard me mention it before, and that is really what it is. It tallies up how many people made money who sold properties in the previous quarter or lost money. And so the most recent report is for the March 2023 quarter. And of the people that lost money, so there was over 5,000, so there were 76,000 properties sold in that quarter. There were over 5,000 of those sold at a loss. Okay. Of those 5,000, just a little bit over 1,200 of them had owned the property between 8 and 10 years. So if it's true that properties double every 10 years, tell that to those 1,200 or so people that sold after owning it for 8 or 10 years and actually lost money. So it's
about asset selection. start, is so important. And as you say, the advice has to be right and it has to be based on the right information. And just assuming that property doubles every 10 years in a capital city, not the right advice. You've got to dig deeper. You've got to go more granular. You've got to go individual property.
You do. So another quote, we're going to finish up with another quote from this, the original report, which is the 30-year report. For those that believe housing values double every 10 years, you might need to think again. None of the capital cities recorded a doubling in dwelling values over the past 10 years. The closest was Sydney at 97.6% growth. So we almost made it. Although, as I mentioned to you, or Megan mentioned that to you, I saw properties that had doubled in 5 years over that period of time. So, individual properties definitely did. And over the previous decade, that's 2002 to 2012, Perth and Darwin were the only capital cities to double in value with gains of 103.8% and 105.5% respectively. But what happened in the following decade with both of those cities? They lost huge amount of money. And I think there's something like Perth, for instance, I think it was 20% down after 10 years. So these, just because they're little darlings of one period, you've got to look at why. And there was mining boom. There's lots of reasons. We won't go into that right now. But what we just try to do is really just open your eyes to understanding that these blanket statements can be misleading. And
I just want to just throw one more thing in there, Veronica. It depends which decade you're choosing as well, right? So we're talking about this period of time, 2002, 2012. I know there was huge gains in those markets, but if you did a different decade, 2005, 2015, I actually think the data would be quite different because it depends which periods you're actually including in that decade data. Because if you have one of those really big, as you say, Perth 20% down, I think you said.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, if you included that in a data set that had some up and some down, it might average out to 80%, 70%. Do you know what I mean?
Such a good point. Yeah.
Just because those 10 years were chosen for the data analysis doesn't necessarily mean if you chose another 10 years, not on top or below, but, around that, might be a really different answer.
It's so true. If you did slide your scale a little bit further, a little back.
Scale, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
That's it. Just slide your scale.
Yep.
It's really good. And so all we're doing here is just trying to open your eyes to interrogating the data a bit better and understanding the difference between aggregate data and individual property decisions. And that's really why just listening to anyone that says to you, property doubles every 10 years is bad advice.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers. If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out your first home buyer guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. We hope you've found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.